Hey guys, what's going on? I'm back in my car again. I know I'm not really posting anything from the garden or from the the land or anything, but I just keep having these ideas hit my head depending on what I'm reading or listening to, or what's going on, and it's everything's getting so crazy out there right now. I've heard with everything going on in the Middle East and the Strait of Hormuz being closed, everyone's talking about how, fertilizer is going to be very difficult to come by, and, depending on how things go, potentially you won't be able to get it. And that, people are starting to panic over stuff like that. And it made me think about, I'd already somewhat talked about this in a previous video, and there's a lot of people who've talked about it on their own, a lot of people who are much better and smarter at gardening than I am, but talking about creating your own fertilizer. And it just hit me again that, maybe this needs to be reiterated, because if we do end up having a fertilizer shortage, or basically you won't be able to get fertilizer, because if fertilizer becomes hard to come by, of course they're going to prioritize the large factory farms before they prioritize small farms or home gardeners or whatever. So the people like us are not going to be able to get it. So what are you supposed to do then if you have poor soil and you are trying to raise your own food so that you can have something to eat in case things get really bad? What are you supposed to do? And I just want people to think about, you can create your own fertilizer. There are so many different ways to make your own fertilizer. Obviously, if you have your own cattle, or if you have your own chickens, or horses, or goats, or rabbits, or sheep, those are fertilizer making machines. So now there's different ways that you have to treat the manure from various animals. For example, rabbit manure you can put right onto a garden bed. Rabbit manure is not hot, as they would say. But the rest of what I was saying is going to need to be composted so that it can, some of the nitrogen can break down and it's not too hot. There's multiple ways to do it, and I'm not going to get into all that in this video because that's not really what I'm talking about. But that's one very obvious, very, I would say, easy way. I don't have any livestock animals, so I can't completely say easy because I don't know exactly what I'm doing. But I've heard from people who have livestock that that's just the best, and really it is, especially like cows and chickens, and it's the way that fertility has been placed in the soil for millennia. But let's say you don't have any livestock, or you don't have any friends or family with livestock that you can get manure from. And I'm not going to get into the issues of aminopyrrolid spraying and it basically contaminating the manure, especially with herbivores. That's another, I've talked about that. David the Good's talked about that. There's a lot of people who've talked about that, and I would say, if you want to know more about that and the dangers of that, then check those guys out, because they, again, are a lot more knowledgeable than I am. But if you don't have any source of animal manure, then there are still ways that you can make your own fertilizer. One of the ways I've started doing it is vermicomposting, which I've found thus far to be very easy and I would reference you to Elise Pickett with, I think it's the Urban Harvest, I think it's the name of her company and her channel. She's located in St. Pete, Florida, and she has I've actually taken a class from her about the best way to vermicompost in Florida because of the heat and the rain and all that stuff. So I would highly recommend checking out her videos on vermicomposting, but it's really not all that difficult. And vermicomposting is a great way to recycle the food scraps that you get in your kitchen. You know, you got all these food scraps, and you can look up the statistics on how many pounds of food scraps per year are sent to a landfill to just sit there, or they're sent to a composting facility, and so they have to be trucked to the composting facility. They get composted there, and then they have to be, trucked to factories to be put into bags, and then they have to be trucked to the, Home Depots and Lowe's and all that stuff of the world, and then they have, it's just a big long process for something that could be handled by having chickens, having pigs, having vermicomposting. It doesn't make sense. So vermicomposting is a great way. And another thing you can do, if you, let's say you have chickens and you're collecting their manure, you can compost the chicken manure in a pile for a little while, and then take that manure and actually put it in with your worms, and they will eat the rest of it down, and it's just amazing what they can do. And then you have the fresh worm castings, which are, it's a great source of, and the thing is, it's like, it's not, it is fertilizer, but it's not fertilizer like what we think of fertilizer. Stuff like worm castings and animal manure is adding, it's adding fertility to the soil, but it's also adding micronutrients to the soil, and it's feeding the soil microbiome, because there's a huge web of fungi and bacteria and all those sort of things in the soil. And that's one of the things that we've lost in modern farming, is the soil is not just some holding place that, okay, you stick a plant's roots down in there and it keeps it still, but we got to pour NPK on it so that it, the roots can pull that up, and it really doesn't matter what's in the soil. It's just a placeholder kind of type thing. No, the soil is way, way more important than that. And until we get back to that, we're going to continue to lose soil fertility. We're going to continue to struggle with all of these issues that we've been having, where we're having soil erosion, and the soil is losing its fertility. It's got no microbiome anymore, and all that stuff. And that is purely because of the overuse of chemical fertilizers. So that's another rant I could go on, but for now I'm saying that's what things like manure and worm castings and stuff do, is adds the it helps build the microbiome in the soil, and it's not just adding nitrogen or whatever. So that's another way you can make your own fertilizers, vermicomposting. And even if you don't have that, or you don't have the space for that, which you really don't need much space to vermicompost, even if you lived in an urban area in an apartment, you can keep just a 5-gallon bucket of worms and feed them your food scraps. And if you had just some potted plants out on your balcony, that would be enough worm castings to fertilize the plants that you have in your pots. So it's really, really not difficult at all. But then let's just say, whatever, you don't want to do that, fine. So you can make your own liquid fertilizer from just weeds in your yard. Or you can take plants, if you wanted to get very specific, you can take, let's say you were growing a bunch of tomatoes and you wanted to make tomato fertilizer. Well, you take those dead, when the tomato plants die, or you take cuttings, you clean up your tomato vine, take snippets off of it. You can soak those in water for a couple weeks, and then it makes a concentrated anaerobic, just really like pond water. Basically, it's pretty gross. It stinks, but I like what David the Good says. Plants don't have noses, so they don't care if it stinks. But so you can do that, and then everything that a tomato needs is in the plant that it's growing on. So now you have tomato fertilizer, which would probably work for other nightshades as well. But you don't have to be crop specific. That may be the ideal way to do it, but you don't have to do it that way. One of the things I do is I grow Mexican sunflower because it has high levels of like nitrogen and stuff like that in the leaves, and they grow really fast. So I let them grow up. I will cut them down, take the leaves and some of the stems, cut up some of the stems, do the same thing, soak it for a couple weeks, and then you dilute it down, and you basically it's like fertigation, and you just keep doing that because you cut it down and it grows back extremely fast. There are other things you can use depending on where you are, like vetiver grass, just various different like grasses and fast growing plants. You can also use fast growing trees. You could look up syntropic agroforestry and see how they do things. They intentionally grow what people would call junk or garbage trees because they grow so fast that they can chop and drop, or they can take it and create liquid fertilizer with it, and it grows so fast you can consistently have a source of fertility because it grows so fast. It just keeps going all the time. So if you live in Central Florida, one of the trees that you probably have is the golden rain tree, and those trees grow extremely fast. You can cut the tops off, take the leaves and the stems, and make fertilizer with it, and then by the time you need more fertilizer, they're already growing back. So those are good things to use. And then of course, the just standard composting. And a really, really good source of information on this is David the Good's book, Compost Everything. Because he goes through various different ways to compost, but he also makes it easy to understand, and basically, is you don't have to have all these fancy composting systems. Because, for example, in the forest, out in the wild, how do things get composted? Well, dead animals, dead tree limbs, dead wood, dead leaves, dead bugs, all those things just land on the ground and get eaten by the decomposers, and everything's put back in the ground. So you could literally just walk outside if you have the space to do it and take whatever you want to compost and throw it on the ground and make a pile. You don't have to have some fancy composting system. You don't have to have any. You can just throw stuff on the ground and compost right there. You can compost in place, which is what chopping and dropping is. You're just composting in place. Instead of putting it in a pile, you're just dropping it right where you're going to put it anyways. So there are so many ways for us to make our own fertility, and so many ways for us to build up soil health, which is what we need to be focusing on, is building up soil health, building up the soil microbiome, and that will lend to fertility and lend to soil health, and it will turn sand back into soil instead of just being loose sand, and it'll loosen up clay and all that stuff, and it will it's much more important for the plant roots to have that symbiotic relationship with the bacteria and the fungi in the soil than it is just to give them NPK. And, you know, I'm not saying never ever use fertilizer, but we have to understand that because it's a big long supply chain, there is a chance that if that chain broke down, you can't get fertilizer, or it'll be so expensive you won't be able to afford it. And so that's why I'm saying we need to be focusing on building soil health and doing it, making our own ways of fertility, so that if the supply chain breaks down, like they keep talking about, if the supply chain for fertilizer breaks down, we don't have to rely on their supply chain. We don't have to rely on the factories making fertilizers and the shipping and all that sort of stuff. We've got it right in our backyards. We don't need their products anymore. We don't need to buy from them. We don't need the inputs. We can make it ourselves. And I just think that that is an important thing to, whenever you start hearing about, oh, the fertilizer is getting, you know, this place can't ship it or whatever, there's a shortage, it's expensive, blah, blah, blah. You know, don't panic. That's the worst thing you could do. Start thinking of, how can I make my own fertility right here where I am, and I don't need to buy all these inputs and continue to make these big ag CEOs super rich and all those sort of things. Another good book to read and videos to watch if you're interested is the Jadam Korean natural farming method. They go through all sorts of ways how they have a commercial farm in South Korea, and they make all their own fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, everything, and it's completely natural. They make it from everything that's right there in their land. And so using their pesticides, you know, there's no chemicals, there's no glyphosate, there's no anything like that. It's all made from whatever's growing right there in their land. And they know how to concentrate certain things down that work as pesticides and all sorts of things. So I highly recommend that book and watching their videos. Now, a caveat to theirs is you have to scale down what they're doing, because, you know, they have a large scale production of all of their fertilizers and their, you know, pesticides and everything, because they have a large farm. So you have to scale it down to whatever size you're dealing with. But it's still learning the methodology of that is very important, and I would say get on. You can order that book on Amazon, read the book, they have videos, watch the videos, see if you can find I think they have ones that are translated into English. I mean, if you know Korean, it's not a problem, but yeah, we need to focus on this, guys. We need to be focusing on making our own fertility so that we don't need to rely on their supply chains that are fragile and can break down at any time. So anyways, just wanted to get on and reiterate this stuff. Don't panic when you're hearing this stuff, you know, in the news. I would tell you, turn the news off, but don't panic when you're hearing this stuff. Just get out there and start taking it into your own hands and realizing I don't have to rely on their inputs. So that's all I got for today, and hopefully sometime soon I'll be back with a video of what's going on out in my land and what I'm doing. But yeah, just wanted to get on there and talk about that again. Thanks for watching.